About a few months ago, I uploaded a video called "Did You Know GTA 4 Breaks at High FPS?" In that video, I looked at a handful of ways the game starts behaving inconsistently once the frame rate goes beyond what it was originally designed for. After that video went up, a lot of people pointed out even more high frame rate issues, some of which I was already aware of and others I hadn't run into myself. A few console players also mentioned seeing similar issues through backwards compatibility. This video picks up where that one left off, looking at some of the other ways GTA 4 starts falling out of sync at higher frame rates. First up is something that's easy to miss unless you compare it directly, that being motion blur. By default, GTA 4 applies motion blur when the definition setting is turned off in the graphic settings. What's interesting is how the effect changes as the frame rate increases. At 30 FPS, motion blur is very pronounced. You get heavy streaking behind movement and it's immediately noticeable. At 60 FPS, those streaks are still present, but they're noticeably softer. The effect is already weaker compared to 30 FPS. Camera shake while running also changes at higher frame rates. At around 30 FPS, you get a noticeable shake as Nico moves. But once the frame rate reaches 60 FPS or higher, that shake becomes much weaker. The handbrake camera is something a lot of players have complained about, especially when you're driving quickly and drift around corners. At around 30 FPS, the camera actually stays in sync with the car as you turn. But as the frame rate increases, the camera actually spins out of control when trying to take that turn. Rain streaks are another visual detail that changes as the frame rate increases. At around 30 FPS, the streaks appear longer and more pronounced, which makes rainfall easier to notice during movement. As the frame rate goes higher, those streaks become much shorter. If you've played darts in GTA 4 before, you might have noticed that the aiming cursor either shakes a lot or barely moves at all, and that behavior depends strictly on the frame rate. At 30 FPS, the cursor has a noticeable jitter. It constantly vibrates, which makes lining up shots more difficult. At 60 FPS and higher, that movement is greatly reduced. In some cases, the cursor becomes almost perfectly still. Bowling behaves very differently at high frame rates and in a couple of ways. At 30 FPS, you can pull the mouse back and push it forward to take a shot normally. At that point, the game registers your input. At very high frame rates, that same motion with your mouse often doesn't trigger the shot at all. You can repeat the same back and forth movement with your mouse, but the game just refuses to register your input. Steering the ball is also affected. At 30 FPS, you can adjust the ball within your lane and it mostly stays where it's supposed to, unless you gutter it, of course. At very high frame rates, however, the ball can oversteer out of the lane and potentially leave the camera's frame entirely. Bowling has another frame rate dependent issue. In the bowling alley, the pin setter animation actually speeds up as the frame rate increases. At 30 FPS, the machine lowers and resets the pins at a normal speed. But at higher frame rates, the pin setter's speed is noticeably quicker. Air hockey also has its own issues at higher frame rates. At around 30 FPS, the game behaves normally. The opponent reacts to the puck, moves around the table, and actively plays the match. At very high frame rates, the opponent can become unresponsive, sometimes holding the puck in a corner or barely moving at all. When that happens, the puck can remain stuck for long stretches, and the match effectively stalls. Arm wrestling in The Lost and Damned also behaves differently depending on the frame rate. At around 30 FPS, the match plays out as expected. You can keep up with the opponent and maintain control during the match. At very high frame rates, that balance begins to shift. Even with rapid mouse movement or aggressive input on the right stick of a controller, the opponent will still quickly overpower you and make the match very difficult to win. In the mission Truck Hustle, Nico is meant to jump onto a moving truck and climb up to the cab. At around 30 FPS, this sequence behaves as expected. Climbing input is responsive and you can steadily work your way up the truck. At higher frame rates, however, that changes. You can keep tapping the button to climb, but it's less responsive, which makes it harder to get up the truck.
I don't even like fun.
Helicopters also start behaving differently at higher frame rates, particularly when it comes to rotor contact. In both cases here, I'm lightly brushing the rotor against the same surface. At lower frame rates, the rotor can stay in contact for several seconds before detaching. At higher frame rates, however, the rotor comes off much sooner. Here's another thing you might have noticed. At 30 FPS, the rotor clearly spins slower, and at around 100 FPS, it appears to spin much faster. You can even hear the blades hitting the surface even more rapidly in comparison to 30 FPS, which likely contributes to them breaking off much sooner. At very high frame rates, walking speed begins to increase. Under normal frame rates, like 30 or 60 FPS, holding the same input moves Nico at a consistent pace. At higher frame rates, he simply walks faster than he does at lower frame rates. However, this doesn't just affect walking. Both jogging and sprinting are effectively quicker at higher FPS. At very high frame rates, NPC movement starts to behave differently. In some situations, NPCs get stuck trying to move through doors or around objects. Instead of being able to move forward, they repeatedly walk into the obstacle they're stuck on and loop a flinch-like animation. This behavior can even occur when you're meeting little Jacob for the first time. But at lower frame rates, such as 30 FPS, this won't happen.
Alright brother, forward at Dillon Street in Shatla.
Toll booth gates are affected in a similar way to the chain link fence gates from the previous video. At 30 FPS, the gate opens at a steady, normal speed. At 60 FPS, the opening animation speeds up. And at very high frame rates, the gate can open almost instantly compared to lower frame rates. High frame rates can also affect certain missions. One instance is in the mission Easy as Can Be. After dropping off the Oracle at Brucey's garage, a short scene plays where Nico talks with the mechanic. After that, Nico begins to walk out of the garage as the door closes behind him. At lower frame rates, like 30 FPS, this works as intended. Nico will exit the garage, the door closes, and the mission ends. At higher frame rates, however, the door closes too quickly and shuts before he can even walk out. Nico then gets stuck endlessly walking in front of the door. The only way to finish the mission at that point is to skip the scene manually. Another issue that can show up at higher frame rates is infinite mission loading screens. In some cases, after starting or restarting a mission, the game never finishes loading. The loading screen continues indefinitely and the mission never begins. When this happens, the only option is to restart the game. Another mission-specific bug shows up during the elevator sequence at the Majestic Hotel in the mission Late Checkout. At normal frame rates, such as 30 FPS, the camera stays framed inside the elevator. At higher frame rates, however, the camera can break out of frame. Instead of staying inside the elevator, it clips through the building and makes it seem like the interior of the elevator disappears completely. You can briefly see the outside world and the city below. Very similar to the mission Out of Commission from the previous video, a Revenger's Tragedy is another mission that suffers greatly at higher frame rates, but for different reasons. At 30 FPS, the mission plays out normally. You chase Dimitri by boat, keep up with them along the river, and that's where little Jacob swoops in and picks you up in his helicopter. Near the end of the chase, Dimitri's helicopter fires what appears to be a homing rocket in your direction. However, it misses and the chase continues. Everything from this point forward should carry out the way it should. At around 60 FPS, however, that changes. That same homing rocket can actually strike Jacob's helicopter instead of missing, causing it to explode and instantly fail the mission. At very high frame rates, things can break much earlier during the chase. In multiple trials at around 100 FPS, Jacob's helicopter wasn't visible during the chase at all. When I checked the minimap, his blip appeared to be over in Leftwood, and it wasn't moving. This behavior seemed kind of odd, considering that it says, "Get underneath little Jacob's chopper." But in another run, I discovered why this is happening. Jacob's helicopter actually takes off from behind a police station in Leftwood. Shortly after taking off, he flew straight into a nearby billboard, causing the helicopter to explode before even reaching the river. Ultimately, that causes the mission to fail. During the mission, It's Your Call, you're supposed to drop off Roman at the hardware store. As soon as you arrive, a cutscene plays where he gives Nico his phone and tells him to call if the loan sharks show up. During that cutscene, the camera will slowly zoom in towards the car. At very high frame rates, the camera will zoom in much faster than intended, and it'll eventually get too close into the headlight. At times, this can crash the game.
Do not hurt them. I know what you're like, Nico Bellic.
You and your debts, Roman.
On the map, police blips animate much faster than usual at higher frame rates. Rotating siren icons and police helicopter blips noticeably spin quicker. The animated backgrounds on the in-game cell phone are also affected by high frame rates. At 30 FPS, the animated phone background plays at a normal speed. At around 100 FPS, they already run faster than usual, and the effect becomes even more obvious as you increase the frame rate. The typing speed of emails on the in-game computers is affected as well. At lower frame rates like 30 FPS, emails are typed at a normal pace. But at higher frame rates, they're typed much faster than usual. The in-game time or in-game clock is also affected by high frame rate. At 30 FPS, one in-game hour takes about 2 minutes of real time to pass. But at very high frame rates, the time will actually speed up. For example, at around 400 FPS, that same in-game hour can pass in roughly 1 minute and 40 seconds. This means the entire time cycle runs faster than intended at higher frame rates. Before wrapping up, it's worth mentioning that FusionFix is the main project actively addressing many of the issues shown in both this video and the previous one. Using an FPS cap along with FusionFix can help keep the game's behavior more consistent with its intended design. The nice thing about FusionFix is that it does include its own FPS limiter in the graphic settings. The download to FusionFix is linked in the description below. At the end of the day, none of this is about making GTA 4 run perfectly at unlimited frame rates. It's more about understanding how the game was built, and why certain things start to behave differently once you push it beyond what it was originally designed for. Some of these issues are subtle, others are more obvious, but they all point back to the same idea. Very high FPS just isn't ideal for GTA 4, especially on a game that has a broken PC port. A lot of you mentioned delta time in the comments on the last video. Delta time is often brought up when talking about frame rate dependent behavior in games, so I did appreciate seeing that come up here as well. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe. I focus mostly on GTA 4 content like this, and I also have a Discord server if you'd like to join. The link to that is in the description below. With that said, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.